Did you know that the mystery of the lead cross found near the Money Pit on Oak Island might have been solved a long time ago, not by the roar of heavy machinery or the breaking of stone, but by the simple, quiet accumulation of context? It is a question that Edward Reid often asked the empty air of his study, usually long after the sun had set, when the only light came from the green glass lamp on his desk and the only sound was the settling of the house around him. Edward was not a treasure hunter. He did not own a shovel, nor did he possess the feverish gleam in the eye that characterized the men who had spent 200 years tearing apart the small island off the coast of Nova Scotia. Edward was a researcher, a man who believed that the truth of history was rarely found in the ground, but rather in the margins of what had been written down and then forgotten. He sat now with a replica of the artifact in his hand. It was a small thing, unassuming and dull. A lead cross, no longer than a finger, with a small hole drilled through the top and a slightly asymmetrical shape. It felt heavy for its size, cold to the touch. To the casual observer, it looked like a piece of scrap, a discard from a fisherman's net or a crude trinket made by a bored soldier. But to Edward, and to the long line of historians he had studied, it was a sentence written in metal, a sentence that most people had forgotten how to read. The story of Oak Island was loud. It was a story of flooding tunnels, collapsing shafts, gold coins, and tragic deaths. It was a narrative of obsession. But the cross was silent. It had been pulled from the mud of Smith's Cove, an area that had been terraformed and re-engineered so many times that the original geography was little more than a memory. When the cross was found, the world gasped. Theories proliferated instantly. Was it Phoenician? Was it a relic of the goddess Tanit? Was it Spanish? The shape was unusual, certainly, but Edward knew that unusual did not mean magical. He placed the lead cross on the map spread out before him. It was not a map of Canada. It was a map of southern France, specifically the Languedoc region, drawn with the precise, artistic cartography of the 19th century. Edward's work had begun with a simple chemical fact, a piece of data that was often cited but rarely understood in its entirety. The lead used to cast the cross was not from the Americas. It was not English. Isotopic analysis, the fingerprint of the metal itself, pointed toward a specific vein of ore in the Gardon Valley of France. This was the problem that kept Edward awake, the anomaly that refused to fit into the standard narrative of pirates and buried chests. Pirates did not carry lead crosses from medieval French mines. Pirates dealt in Spanish silver and Portuguese gold. They were opportunistic, fluid, chaotic. The object on his desk was not chaotic. It was structured. It was cast with intention. It spoke of an organization, of a supply chain, of a memory that stretched back to a time before the age of sail, to a time when silence was a commodity more valuable than gold. Edward leaned back in his leather chair, the leather creaking softly in the room. He closed his eyes and allowed his mind to drift away from the damp soil of Nova Scotia, crossing the Atlantic in a heartbeat, moving backward through the centuries until he arrived in the dry, sun-baked stone corridors of the 12th century. He was thinking about infrastructure. Most people, Edward realized, thought of the Knights Templar as warrior monks, men in white mantles charging across the desert sands, or as the guardians of the Holy Grail, hiding secret bloodlines in the shadows of history. Fiction had been kind to the Templars, painting them as mystics and martyrs. But the reality Edward had found in the dusty archives of Paris and Rome was far more formidable and far less romantic. The Templars were not just soldiers, they were the world's first multinational corporation. They were logisticians. They were bankers. They had solved a problem that had plagued civilization for 1,000 years, how to move value across dangerous territory without being robbed. They built roads, they managed ports, they secured borders. They created a system where a pilgrim could deposit coin in London and withdraw it in Jerusalem, carrying only a piece of paper, a letter of credit, as proof. Edward opened his eyes and looked at the lead cross again. In the quiet of the night, the connection seemed to solidify. The Templars did not just move money, they moved people. They moved secrets. And like any massive bureaucracy, they had administrative tools. They had markers. His research had taken him, physically and intellectually, into the deep archives of the French military orders. He remembered the smell of the old paper, the scent of vanilla and decay, the feeling of gloves on his hands as he turned pages that had not been read in centuries. He had been looking for a connection to the New World, but what he found was a connection to the concept of safe passage. In the medieval world, lead was a functional metal. It was used for seals, for water pipes, for roofing, and for tokens. It was the plastic of the Middle Ages. Edward had seen sketches in a forgotten folio in a library in Lyon, sketches of pilgrimage tokens and identification markers used by the orders to signify status or completion of a journey. They were not holy relics to be worshipped, they were receipts. They were proof that a toll had been paid, or a duty discharged. The complication, the thing that made the Oak Island cross so difficult for the public to understand, was the context of its finding. It was found in a place of chaos. But the object itself was a creature of order. Edward picked up a magnifying glass and hovered over the map of France. He traced the line from the mines in the Gardon Valley down to the port of La Rochelle. La Rochelle had been a Templar stronghold, their primary window onto the Atlantic. It was from there, history whispered, that their fleet had vanished in the autumn of 1307, slipping away into the fog just as the King of France unleashed his purge to destroy the order. The standard legend said they fled with treasure. Edward found that idea exhausting. Treasure is heavy. Treasure is slow. If you are an organization built on intelligence and logistics, and you know the end is coming, you do not load your ships with gold that will weigh you down. You load them with what matters. You load them with the archives. You load them with the maps. You load them with the proof of debts owed and alliances made. Edward imagined the scene, not as a dramatic movie sequence, but as a quiet, desperate operation in the rain. Men moving crates, not of jewels, but of parchment. And perhaps, among the captains and the navigators, there were tokens passed around. Small lead crosses, easily cast, easily carried. Not symbols of faith, but symbols of recognition. A way to say, without speaking, *I am part of the structure. I am part of the silence. The pressure of the story began to weigh on Edward, the sheer scale of the timeline. The cross in the money pit was not just a dropped item. It was a marker of arrival. He stood up and walked to the window. The reflection of the room stared back at him, a ghost in the glass. He thought about the carvings in the prison tower of Dôme, in the Dordogne region of France. There, imprisoned Templars had carved graffiti into the soft stone walls while awaiting execution or starvation. Edward had visited Dôme. He had run his fingers over the rough indentations. There were crosses there, etched by dying men. They were not the ornate crosses of the church. They were geometric, triangular, oddly shaped. They matched the silhouette of the object found on Oak Island. This was where the patterns began to align, creating a picture that was both boring and terrifying. The cross was not a clue to a future treasure hunt. It was a closed sign. Edward returned to his desk and picked up a pen, twirling it between his fingers. He thought about the nature of the money pit itself. For 2 centuries, men had believed it was a vault. They believed the complex system of flood tunnels, the layers of logs, the coconut fiber, the clay, were all designed to keep people *out*. But Edward's research into medieval hydraulic engineering suggested a different possibility. The Templars were masters of water. They built mills, irrigation systems, and moats. They understood how to use water to work, and how to use water to hide. What if the engineering on Oak Island was not a bank vault, but a scuttling mechanism? If the fleet had arrived there, fleeing the persecution in Europe, they would have been at the end of their world. They were not colonizers, they were refugees. They needed to disappear. They needed to take the infrastructure of their order, the names, the routes, the leverage they held over the crowns of Europe, and make it vanish until it was needed again. The lead cross, Edward surmised, was likely worn by one of the men who oversaw the closure. It was a piece of administrative debris. He looked at the cross again, seeing it now not as a religious icon, but as a tool. The hole at the top was worn, suggesting it had been on a cord or a chain for a long time. It had rubbed against fabric, against armor, against skin. It had traveled from the mines of the Gardon Valley, been cast in a workshop in the Languedoc, carried to the coast, worn across the terrifying expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, and finally, it had come to rest in the mud of a small island in the north. The realization that was forming in Edward's mind was quiet, like the settling of dust. The mystery of Oak Island was not that they could not find the treasure. The mystery was that they could not find the * people star. There was no settlement. There were no mass graves found, no barracks, no remains of a great fortress. Just the pit, and the silence. This was the genius of the Templar structure. They did not build a new kingdom. They dissolved. They integrated. They stopped being the order and started being distinct individuals, melting into the landscape, perhaps moving south to the mainland, perhaps blending with the indigenous populations, or perhaps dying quietly of exposure and time. The cross was left behind because it was no longer needed. The structure it represented had been dismantled. Edward thought about the concept of the marker. In intelligence work, a marker is an object or a sign left to signal that a meeting has occurred, or a drop has been made. It is a communication that requires no words. The lead cross was a period at the end of a sentence. It said, * we were here. We finished the work. We are gone. * the silence was the mechanism. Edward realized this was the part that the treasure hunters missed. They were looking for something shiny to hold up to the cameras. They wanted a golden ark or a jeweled crown. They wanted noise. But the people who buried the money pit, whoever they were, whether Templars or those who learned from them, wanted the opposite. They wanted the earth to heal over. They wanted the scrub oak to grow back. They wanted the wind to erase their footprints. The lead cross was a glitch in that silence. It was a small error, a dropped key, that had survived the centuries to confuse the future. Edward rubbed his eyes. The fatigue of the night was setting in, a comfortable heaviness. He thought about the vast distances of history. How a man in 1307 could look at a piece of lead and see safety, and a man in the present day could look at the same piece of lead and see a riddle. The Tanit theory, the idea that the cross represented a Carthaginian goddess, had always bothered Edward. It was too exotic, too desperate. It relied on the shape alone, ignoring the context of the material and the location. But the Templar connection relied on the mundane. It relied on supply chains, shipping routes, and the known habits of a bureaucratic military order. It was less exciting than ancient goddesses, perhaps, but it had the heavy, dull ring of truth. The cross was lead because lead was practical. It was shaped that way because that was the heraldry or the coding of a specific preceptory within the order. It was on Oak Island because that is where the ship stopped. Edward imagined the final days on the island, centuries ago. The digging was done. The flood tunnels were active. The trap was set, not to kill looters, but to destroy the contents if disturbed. The men would have been tired. Their grand white mantles would have been stained with mud and salt. They were no longer the lords of Europe. They were fugitives. One of them, perhaps standing on the shore of Smith's Cove, might have taken the cross from his neck. He might have held it for a moment, thinking of the vineyards in France, of the stone chapels, of the life that was now ashes. And then, he dropped it. Or he lost it in the struggle of loading a boat. Or he threw it down as a gesture of finality. I am no longer a knight. I am just a man. The object sank into the soft clay. The tide came in. The tide went out. The seasons turned. Trees grew and died. The Mi'kmaq people passed through, fishing and hunting, leaving the land as they found it. The silence deepened. Then came the boys with the shovels in 1795, and the noise began. Edward felt a profound sense of calm settle over him. The revelation was not a thunderclap. It was a realignment of perspective. The treasure hunters were trying to solve a puzzle that had been designed to be unsolvable. They were trying to read a book that had been burned. But the cross remained. It was the witness. Edward picked up the replica one last time. He weighed it in his palm. It was a testament to the power of belief, certainly, but also a testament to the power of infrastructure. It proved that the world was smaller than we think. That the Atlantic was not a wall, but a bridge, crossed by men who were driven by necessity. He understood now that the treasure was likely information. It was leverage. And like all information from the Middle Ages, it had an expiration date. Whatever the Templars hid, whatever secrets they carried to the New World, those secrets had likely lost their power centuries ago. The blackmail material against a French king who died in 1314 is of no use today. The deed to a fortress that is now dust is worth nothing. The tragedy of the money pit was that men were dying to find a safe that was empty. Or rather, a safe that contained only the ghosts of a political struggle that ended 700 years ago. Edward set the cross down on the desk, placing it gently on the map, right over the blue expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. He turned off the green lamp. The room plunged into darkness, save for the moonlight filtering through the curtains. He sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the silence of the house. He thought about how much of history was like this, buried, misinterpreted, shouted over. We want the past to be a story of heroes and villains, of gold and curses. We struggle to accept that it is often just a story of logistics, of men tired and cold, moving things from one place to another, and leaving small pieces of themselves behind in the mud. The mystery of the lead cross was solved, in Edward's mind at least. It was not a question mark. It was a period. It marked the end of a long journey and the beginning of a long silence. And as he finally stood to leave the study, leaving the cross in the shadows, Edward felt that the silence was not empty. It was full. It was complete. And it was enough. He walked to the door, the floorboard settling under his weight. He did not need to dig any more. He did not need to prove anything to the world. The world would keep watching the television shows and reading the sensational headlines. They would keep drilling and draining, looking for the shine of gold. But Edward knew the truth of the lead. It was dull, it was heavy, and it was toxic if mishandled. It was the perfect material for a secret. He stepped out into the hallway, closing the door to the study softly behind him. The house was still. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, a sound that was the same in Nova Scotia as it was in France, a sound that had been blowing since long before the first ship set sail. Edward climbed the stairs, the day's research finally put to rest, content in the knowledge that some things are not lost, only waiting for the right kind of quiet to be heard. The lead cross lay on the desk in the dark, a small, gray anchor in a sea of paper, holding the map down, holding the history in place, silent as the grave, and solved. The morning light did not bring the finality Edward had expected. Instead, it brought a stark, gray clarity that exposed the cracks in his own theory. He stood in the doorway of the study with a cup of black coffee, watching the dust motes dance in the pale shafts of sun that cut across the desk. The lead cross was exactly where he had left it, pinning down the map of France, but now, in the daylight, it looked less like a period at the end of a sentence and more like a comma. Edward walked to the desk and set the coffee down. He picked up the cross. It was cold, retaining the chill of the room. The night before, he had satisfied himself with the idea of the cross as a token of identity, a badge for a refugee. But as he turned the object over in his fingers, feeling the rough, oxidized surface, the researcher in him began to nag. The explanation was too passive. The Templars were not passive men. They were engineers. They were builders of cathedrals and castles. They did not make things that simply were asterisk, they made things that did star. He looked closely at the asymmetry of the cross. It was not a mistake of the casting. The bottom arm was slightly bulbous, heavier. The hole at the top was drilled with precision, but it was off-center just enough to affect the balance if suspended. Edward opened a drawer and pulled out a spool of heavy thread. He cut a length, threaded it through the hole in the lead cross, and held the string up, allowing the artifact to dangle freely. It did not hang straight. The weighted bottom arm pulled it into a specific angle, a precise tilt. It stabilized quickly, refusing to spin. It was not just a pendant, it was a plumb bob. He watched it sway gently, a pendulum of history. In the medieval world, before the advent of magnetic compasses that were reliable across the Atlantic, navigation was an affair of the stars and the plumb line. You needed to know the vertical to find the horizon. You needed to know the horizon to measure the stars. Edward sat down, the coffee forgotten. He pushed the map of France aside and pulled a fresh legal pad toward him. He began to draw. He drew the shape of Oak Island. He drew the location of the money pit. Then, he drew the location of the stone triangle, another verified anomaly found on the south shore of the island in the earliest days of the excavation. The stone triangle had been an arrow, pointing north. The money pit was due north. The geometry was simple, almost childishly so, until one considered the scale. Edward's mind went back to the archives in Portugal, to the Order of Christ, the rebranded Templars who had survived the purge by simply changing their name. They had sponsored the great age of exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator was a Grand Master. Their sails bore the Red Cross Petit. They were obsessed with mapping the world. He looked at the lead cross swinging on the string. If this was a sighting tool, a primitive inclinometer used to determine latitude, then its presence on Oak Island changed the narrative completely. They were not just hiding. They were surveying. Edward stopped the cross from swinging with his hand. The implication was heavy. If you are hiding a treasure, you dig a hole and you leave. But if you are surveying, you are planning to return. You are marking a 0 point. You are establishing a baseline. He stood up and went to the bookshelf, pulling down a heavy volume on medieval masonry and geometry. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, the sacred geometry, used in the construction of Gothic cathedrals. The 3-4-5 triangle. The golden ratio. The specific angles used to ensure that a spire would not collapse. The Templars built the Chartres Cathedral. They understood that stone and earth could be arranged to mirror the heavens. Edward returned to the desk. He thought about the flood tunnels of the money pit again. The conventional story was that they were booby traps. But Edward knew that in the 12th century, the Cistercian monks, the spiritual brothers of the Templars, were the masters of hydraulic engineering in Europe. They diverted rivers to power their abbeys. They built elaborate drainage systems that kept their foundations dry in swamps. What if the drains on Oak Island were not traps, but functional infrastructure? What if the money pit was not a vault, but a hydraulic pump or a dry dock? Or, more abstractly, a geodetic marker designed to be permanent? Wood rots. Stone crumbles. But the water table is constant. If you build a structure that interacts with the tide, you are building a clock that will last as long as the moon pulls the ocean. Edward felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He realized he had been thinking too small. He had been thinking about a group of frightened men burying a box of gold. He should have been thinking about an empire establishing a colony. He picked up the magnifying glass and looked at the cross again. There were faint markings on the surface, worn down by time, almost invisible to the naked eye. He had seen them before but dismissed them as casting flaws. Now, he looked closer. They were not flaws. They were lines. Scratches made intentionally. He turned the light of the green lamp on, despite the daylight, to get a raking angle. The shadows threw the scratches into relief. They intersected. They formed a grid. It was a grid of latitude. Edward sat back, the breath leaving his lungs in a long, slow exhale. The cross was a key, but not to a lock. It was a key to a map. And the map was the island itself. He thought of the sheer effort required to construct the works on Oak Island. The digging, the coconut fiber brought from the Caribbean, the clay, the stones. It was an industrial effort. It required hundreds of men. It required a fleet. You do not expend that kind of energy to bury a secret. You expend that kind of energy to build a foundation. The silence of the Templars, the system of silence Edward had theorized the night before, was even more profound than he had realized. They had not just disappeared into the population. They had stepped off the map of the known world and started drawing a new one. Edward picked up his pen. He wrote a single word on the legal pad, *Nova Star. New. Nova Scotia. New Scotland. But before that, perhaps, New Temple. He looked at the window, at the trees swaying outside. The history books said that the European discovery of North America happened in 1492, or perhaps with the Vikings much earlier. But the Vikings left only sod houses. They did not leave hydraulic engineering. They did not leave lead crosses with isotopic signatures from the Gardon Valley. Edward realized that the mystery of the lead cross was not about what it was. It was about when it was. If the Templars were on Oak Island in the 14th century, surveying and building, then the history of the Americas was missing a chapter. A chapter that had been carefully excised, not by malice, but by the necessity of survival. He imagined the ships anchored in the deep water. He saw the men on the shore, using the lead cross to sight the North Star, aligning the stone triangle, digging the shaft to the bedrock. They were creating a fixed point in a chaotic universe. A place where, if the order ever fell in Europe, as it did, they could rebuild. But they never did. Or if they did it so quietly that no one noticed. Edward felt the weight of the silence again, but this time it was not peaceful. It was expectant. The cross on his desk was no longer a period. It was an arrow. And it was pointing at something that Edward had not yet looked for. He reached for the phone, then stopped. Who would he call? The archaeologists? The treasure hunters? They would ask for proof. They would ask for gold. Edward had only lead and logic. He put his hand down. He would have to go deeper. He would have to look at the other artifacts found on the island, the iron scissors, the parchment, the bone. He had dismissed them as debris. Now he saw them as part of the kit. Edward Reid picked up the cross and slipped it into his pocket. It felt heavy there, a grounding weight. He walked out of the study, not to leave the work behind, but to prepare. He needed to go to the library. He needed to look at the portal and charts of the 1300s again. He needed to see if the shape of Oak Island was hiding in the ink of maps drawn 300 years before anyone admitted knowing it existed. The story was not over. It was just expanding. The silence was not empty, it was waiting to be read. The drive to the university library was a blur of gray pavement and low-hanging clouds. Edward did not listen to the radio. The silence in the car was a necessary extension of the silence in his study, a container for the fragile new idea he was carrying. He felt a strange protectiveness over it. Ideas, like flames, were easily extinguished by the wind of skepticism, and Edward was not ready to share this flame with anyone yet. The university archives were housed in a brutalist concrete building that smelled of floor wax and old dust. It was a smell Edward loved. It was the scent of suspended time. He nodded to the librarian, a woman who knew him well enough not to ask questions, and made his way to the special collections room. He did not need the computer catalog. He knew exactly where the oversized folios of medieval cartography were kept. He pulled a heavy volume from the shelf, its binding cracking softly, a sound like dry knuckles popping. He carried it to a long wooden table under the harsh fluorescent lights, which seemed too bright for the secrets hidden within the parchment. Edward was looking for portal and charts. These were not the maps of modern geography, with their precise latitudes and longitudes. These were the maps of the mariners of the 13th and 14th centuries. They were webs of lines, rum lines, radiating out from compass roses like spokes on a wheel. They were practical tools, designed for men who steered by the wind and the magnetic needle. They showed the coastlines in exquisite detail, naming every port, every hazard, but the interiors were often blank, or filled with fantastical beasts. Edward turned the pages, moving back through time. 1,500. 1,450. 1,400. He stopped at a reproduction of a Venetian chart from 1380. It depicted the Atlantic Ocean, or the Ocean of Darkness, as it was often called. To the untrained eye, the map ended at the Pillars of Hercules, the exit of the Mediterranean. But to the careful observer, there were islands drawn in the deep Atlantic. Historians called them Phantom Islands. Antillia. High Brazil. The Isle of Seven Cities. They were dismissed as myths, as mirages seen by exhausted sailors, or as cartographic errors copied from one map to another for centuries. Edward took the lead cross from his pocket. He placed it on the table next to the map. He thought about the error theory. It was the easy explanation. But the Templars, and the navigators they employed, were not men who made errors of that magnitude. They were men whose lives depended on precision. If they drew an island, they drew it because someone had been there, or because someone needed to go their star. Edward focused on the web of rum lines crisscrossing the ocean. These lines were vectors. They showed the bearing one must hold to travel from point A to point B. He looked at the line radiating from the port of La Rochelle in France. He traced it with his finger. It shot out across the Bay of Biscay, past the tip of Spain, and out into the open water. On the map, the line terminated in empty parchment. But Edward knew the curvature of the earth. He knew the winds. He took a protractor from his bag, a modern tool to measure an ancient intent. He measured the angle of the bottom arm of the lead cross, the heavy arm that acted as the weight. It was not a 90-degree angle. It was slightly acute. He transferred that angle to the map, aligning it with the La Rochelle Rum line. The line did not point to nothing. It pointed to a specific latitude in the North Atlantic. It pointed, with chilling accuracy, to the 44th parallel north. Oak Island sits at 44 degrees north. Edward sat back, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The connection was not just in the object, it was in the geometry of the world. The lead cross was not just a local survey tool. It was a piece of a global mechanism. He realized then why the Phantom Islands appeared and disappeared on the maps of the Middle Ages. They were not mistakes. They were *redacted star. When a modern government wants to hide a military base, they blur it on satellite images. When a medieval order wanted to hide a refuge, they did not erase it, that would leave a suspicious gap. Instead, they moved it. They drew it in the wrong place. They gave it a mythical name. They turned a real location into a fable so that no serious captain would risk his ship looking for it. Hi Brazil. The Isle of the Blessed. These were not fantasies. They were code names. Edward looked at the shape of Oak Island in his mind again. Two islands, actually, Oak Island and the small, frog-shaped Frog Island nearby. He looked at the cluster of Phantom Islands on the Venetian chart. The shapes were distorted, but the relationship was there. A large landmass, a smaller satellite. The money pit, Edward realized, was likely the anchor point for this deception. If you are going to hide a continent, or at least a foothold on a continent, you need a way to verify your claim if you ever decide to return. You need a marker that cannot be moved by storms or natives. You need a geological scar. The deep shaft, the flood tunnels, the layers of logs, they were a geodetic monument. A massive, underground survey stake. Edward imagined a Templar cartographer in a candlelit room in 1380, drawing this map. He knew the truth. He knew that if he followed the line from La Rochelle, staying true to the angle of the lead cross, he would hit land. But on the parchment, he drew the island 500 miles to the south, and he labeled it with a name from Irish folklore. He was protecting the asset. This was the banking mentality at work. The Templars invented modern banking. And the ultimate asset is not gold. Gold inflates. Gold can be stolen. The ultimate asset is *land star. Safe, arable, defensible land. They had banked North America. They had deposited the knowledge of the New World into their archives, locked it away with a cipher of lead and geometry, and then, when the order was destroyed, the account lay dormant. The interest compounded for centuries in the form of forests growing and rivers flowing, unseen by European eyes. Edward closed the heavy book. The sound was like a door slamming shut. He understood now why the search on Oak Island had always felt so desperate and so futile. The treasure hunters were digging for a withdrawal. They wanted to cash out. But the Templars had made a deposit intended for eternity. The lead cross was the receipt. Edward gathered his things. The library was closing, the lights were flickering in the back rows. He walked out into the cool evening air, the smell of rain now heavy and real. He felt a strange sense of kinship with those long-dead men. They were keepers of secrets. They understood that some truths were too heavy for the world to carry, so they buried them. They buried them in the ground, and they buried them in the maps. Edward got into his car and placed the lead cross on the dashboard. It sat there, a small, gray silhouette against the city lights. He did not need to go back to Nova Scotia. The island was just the lock. He had the key, and he had the map. The real story was not about what was buried in the pit. The real story was that for 200 years, while Europe bled in wars and plagues, a silent clock was ticking on the edge of the Atlantic, waiting for an owner who never came back. Edward started the engine. He would go home. He would write it down. Not as a sensational discovery, but as a footnote to history. A correction. The mystery was solved, but the silence, the vast, ocean-sized silence of the past, remained unbroken. And Edward, driving into the night, was content to let it be. Edward sat before the blank page, the cursor blinking with a rhythmic, demanding pulse. He had intended to write a conclusion, a summary of the facts that linked the mines of the Gardon Valley to the shores of Nova Scotia. He wanted to type the words that would turn the lead cross from a mystery into a museum piece. But the silence of the room, usually his ally, began to feel heavy with an unanswered question. It was the timeline. It was the sheer, crushing weight of the years. Edward picked up the cross again. He held it under the harsh light of the desk lamp, squinting at the loop where the cord had once passed through. He had noted the wear before, the way the soft lead had been eroded by the friction of a string or a chain. But now, he looked at the angle of the wear. It was not worn evenly. The groove was deep and polished, worn smooth by decades, perhaps centuries, of movement against a chest. If the Templars had arrived in the early 14th century, buried their archives, set their markers, and then dissolved into the local population or died off, the cross should have been buried with them. It should have been found in a grave, or dropped in the shaft during the initial construction. But the wear told a different story. The wear spoke of a life lived above ground. Edward set the cross down and walked to the window. The night was absolute, the reflection of his own face staring back at him, tired and pale. He calculated the gap. The Templars vanished in 1307. The money pit was discovered in 1795. That was nearly 500 years. 5 centuries of silence. A secret does not keep itself for 500 years. Nature abhors a vacuum, but it also abhors a static secret. Soil shifts. Trees die. Oral traditions fade. Unless the silence was maintained. Edward realized that his theory of banking North America was incomplete. You do not deposit your fortune in a vault and then walk away for half a millennium without checking the lock. You leave a key. And more importantly, you leave a key holder star. The lead cross was not just a tool for navigation. It was a badge of office. He went back to his bookshelf and pulled down a volume on the history of the Mi'kmaq people, the indigenous inhabitants of Nova Scotia. He turned the pages, looking for the anomalies, the stories that did not quite fit the anthropological standard. He found the legends of the Glooscap, a figure of great power, but he dug deeper, looking for something more mundane. He found references to the men who came from the sea, who were not enemies, but who stayed apart. He found motifs in the indigenous art that echoed the geometric precision of medieval Europe, the 8-pointed star, the specific cross forms. Edward sat down slowly. The realization was chilling. The Templars had not just died out. They had integrated, yes, but they had also recruited star. Or perhaps, a select few families had kept the watch. The cross found in the mud of Smith's Cove was not dropped by a sailor in 1307. It was likely dropped by a descendant in 1600. Or 1700. It meant that for centuries, while the rest of the world forgot, someone on that island remembered. Someone walked the perimeter. Someone checked the flood tunnels to ensure the drains were clear. Someone used the lead cross and the stone triangle to verify that the survey markers had not moved. They were the custodians of the empty vault. Edward imagined a man, dressed in the rough homespun clothes of a settler or the skins of a trapper, standing on the shore in the mid-18th century. He looks like anyone else. But under his shirt, against his skin, hangs the lead cross. He is not a Knight Templar in a white mantle. He is a farmer. A fisherman. But he knows the secret. He knows that the island is not just an island. And then, the tragedy. Edward looked at the map of Smith's Cove. The cross was found near the coffer dam, near the works. Why was it dropped? Perhaps it was not an accident. Perhaps it was the moment the watch ended. The discovery of the money pit in 1795 by three young boys, McGuinness, Vaughan, and Smith, had always been presented as a lucky find. They saw a depression in the ground and a tackle block hanging from an oak tree. But Edward now viewed it through the lens of the custodian. If you are the last in a long line of watchmen, and you see the world changing, the British fleet in Halifax, the settlers encroaching, the roads being built, you realize the secret can no longer be kept by silence alone. The pressure is too great. Maybe the cross was not lost. Maybe it was discarded. Edward imagined that final watchman. Old, perhaps. Tired. The burden of 500 years of history weighing on his neck. He sees the inevitable. The world is coming to Oak Island. The silence is breaking. He cannot stop it. So, he walks to the water's edge. He takes the lead cross, the symbol of his silent duty, the link to the mines of France and the fleets of the order. He feels the weight of it one last time. And he throws it. Or he lets it slip from his fingers into the clay. He abdicates. He allows the boys to find the pit. He allows the trap to be triggered. Because he knows that the engineering is superior to the greed of the searchers. He knows that without the cross, without the geometry, without the specific knowledge of the hydraulic systems, the interlopers will only find water. They will dig, and they will flood. They will spend millions of dollars and centuries of time chasing a ghost, while the true history, the history of the map and the land, remains safe because it is too big to be seen. Edward felt a profound sense of sorrow for that unknown man. To be the one who ends the vigil. To be the one who lets the secret go. The money pit was not a bank. It was a decoy. A distraction. The real treasure was the continent itself, and that had already been claimed, mapped, and integrated into the world. The vault was empty because the assets had been distributed. The land was the treasure. Edward typed a single sentence on the screen. Asterisk: the mechanism of the island was not designed to protect gold, it was designed to waste time. Asterisk: it was a time capsule that destroyed the time of anyone who tried to open it. It was a perfect defensive weapon. And the lead cross was the safety pin that had been pulled. He turned off the computer. He did not need to write the book. The story was too quiet for a book. It belonged to the wind and the damp soil. Edward picked up the cross one last time and placed it in a small wooden box on his desk. He closed the lid. The click was final. He would sleep tonight. He would sleep without dreaming of tunnels or gold. He would dream of the vast, open ocean, and the silent, invisible lines that connected the past to the present, holding the world together while everyone else was busy digging holes in the ground. The mystery was not just solved. It was finished.